The morning of January 12, 1945, somewhere in the frozen wasteland east of Bastogne, Belgium, a German sniper lay motionless in a shallow hide, his breath forming tiny crystals in the -15-degree air. His name was Matthias Hetzenauer, though the American soldiers hunting him knew him only by the bodies he left behind. 23 confirmed kills in 4 days. But what made Hetzenauer different from every other marksman on the Western Front wasn't his rifle, wasn't his training, and wasn't his experience. It was something his instructor had called absurd and tactically unsound back in Bad Tölz. It was the way he tilted his head. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why a simple head position could mean the difference between life and death, between 20 kills and 120, you have to understand what sniper training looked like in the winter of 1944, and more importantly, what it got catastrophically wrong. The German sniper schools of World War II were, by all technical measures, the most advanced in the world. The British had their gamekeepers turned marksmen. The Soviets had their industrialized sniper academies pumping out graduates by the thousands. The Americans had their Marine Corps Scout Sniper program, still in its relative infancy. But the Germans had something different. They had a doctrine, a philosophy, a scientific approach to the act of killing at distance that was taught with the same precision as their tank tactics and artillery calculations. The Reich School for Snipers at Bad Tölz, established in 1942, operated on principles that seemed unassailable. Instructors were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and the retreat from Moscow. They taught that the sniper's greatest asset was invisibility, and invisibility meant absolute stillness. The human eye, they lectured, is drawn to movement above all else. A perfectly camouflaged position becomes useless the moment something moves. Therefore, the sniper must become a part of the landscape. The sniper must not move. This extended to every aspect of the craft. Your breathing must be controlled to the point of suspension. Your trigger finger must move with glacial slowness. And your head, your skull, the platform from which you observe and from which you fire, must remain in perfect alignment with your spine. Any deviation, any tilt, any adjustment of angle was considered not just poor form, but actively dangerous. It created micro-movements, it shifted your center of gravity, it made you visible. The standard German sniper position, as taught at Bad Tölz and replicated at training facilities across the Reich, was this. Prone position, body aligned with the target, head level with the spine, right eye behind the scope, left eye closed. The Carabiner 98K rifle, fitted with a 4-power Zeiss scope, would be locked into the shoulder pocket. The cheek would rest firmly against the stock. Everything would be level, parallel, symmetrical. This was how you achieved consistent accuracy. This was how you survived. Matthias Hetzenauer learned all of this in the autumn of 1944. He was 19 years old, a Tyrolean farm boy who could shoot a Schammer at 400 meters before he could properly read. The Wehrmacht had identified him during basic training, noted his natural marksmanship, and sent him to Bad Tölz for 8 weeks of intensive instruction. He learned to judge distance by eye. He learned to read wind by watching grass and leaves. He learned to calculate the trajectory drop of the 7.92mm round at various ranges. He learned to slow his heart rate, to fire between heartbeats, to become invisible. But there was one thing Hetzenauer couldn't learn. He couldn't learn to keep his head straight. It wasn't defiance, at least not initially. It was biology. Hetzenauer's right eye was dominant, as is the case for roughly 2/3 of all humans. But his left eye was stronger. Not in the way most people understand strength of vision, he could see fine out of his right eye. But his left eye processed depth perception faster, tracked movement more efficiently, and remained focused under stress in ways his right eye didn't. This is not uncommon. Eye dominance and eye strength are not the same thing, and for most people, it doesn't matter. But for a sniper, it mattered enormously. When Hetzenauer positioned himself in the standard way, right eye to the scope, head perfectly aligned, he found himself making constant micro-adjustments. His brain wanted the information from his left eye. His visual cortex was literally wired to prefer input from that side. So, unconsciously, almost imperceptibly, he would tilt his head, just a few degrees, just enough to bring his left eye more into play, to give him peripheral awareness on his strong side, to let his brain process the information it wanted. His instructors noticed immediately. "You shoot like a confused owl," one sergeant told him. "Keep your head straight, or you'll be dead before Christmas." Hetzenauer tried. For 3 weeks, he forced himself to maintain perfect alignment. His scores suffered. His reaction time slowed. In simulation exercises where snipers had to identify and engage pop-up targets representing enemy soldiers, he consistently ranked in the bottom third of his class. The problem wasn't his aim once he had the target in his scope. He could hit it. The problem was acquiring the target in the first place. That critical half-second between "there's movement" and "I have a shot" was taking him too long. Then came the night exercise, late November, 1944. The students were divided into pairs and sent into the Bavarian forest outside Bad Tölz. Each pair had to locate and eliminate an instructor who was hiding somewhere in a 2-kilometer zone. The instructors were veterans, men who had been killed from hides in Russia and France. Finding them was nearly impossible. Finding them without being found yourself was the real test. Hetzenauer and his partner, a Saxon named Klaus Weber, moved through the darkness for 4 hours without success. The instructors had taught them to use their ears as much as their eyes, to move in total silence, to become ghosts. But Weber was nervous, and nervous soldiers made noise. Around 2 in the morning, they heard a sound, a tiny sound, the click of metal on metal, perhaps a rifle barrel touching a button. They froze. Hetzenauer scanned the tree line ahead. Nothing. His training said to remain still, to wait for movement. But his instinct said something different. Without thinking, he tilted his head, 15 degrees to the left, bringing his strong eye into play, widening his field of peripheral vision on that side, and there, at the very edge of his awareness, he saw it. Not movement, absence of movement, a patch of darkness that was too still, too perfect, too controlled. He held up his hand, signaling Weber to wait. Then, moving with the slowness of ice forming on a pond, he brought his rifle up. The head tilt remained. He could feel how wrong it was, how it violated everything he'd been taught. But he could also feel how right it was, how his vision sharpened, how his brain processed the information faster and cleaner than it ever did with his head straight. Through his scope, he found the patch of darkness, focused, and saw the outline of a human form in a ghillie suit, perfectly camouflaged, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Hetzenauer pulled the trigger on his blank training round. The crack echoed through the forest. 10 seconds later, Instructor Hauptfeldwebel Rudolf König stood up from his hide, swearing creatively. "How the hell did you see me?" Hetzenauer couldn't answer. He didn't know. Not yet. 3 more times that night, Hetzenauer spotted hidden instructors. Each time, he did it with his head tilted. Each time, he did it faster than any other student in the exercise. By dawn, when the class reassembled at the base, the instructors were confused. This farm boy who couldn't keep his head straight, who violated basic form with every shot, had somehow outperformed everyone. König pulled him aside. "You're doing something wrong," he said. "But it's working. I don't understand it, but it's working." The next day, Hetzenauer requested permission to conduct an experiment. He wanted to test his accuracy and acquisition time using both methods, the standard head-straight position and his instinctive head tilt. The instructors, intrigued despite themselves, agreed. The results were not subtle. With his head in standard position, Hetzenauer's target acquisition time averaged 2.1 seconds. With his head tilted, it dropped to 0.7 seconds. His accuracy at distances over 300 meters actually improved by 11% with the tilt. Most surprisingly, His peripheral awareness, tested by having instructors fire blank rounds from unexpected angles while he was focused on a target, was nearly 3 times better with the tilted head position. The instructors had no explanation. This wasn't supposed to work. Everything they knew about sniper craft said it shouldn't work. But the numbers didn't lie. Koenig, to his credit, made a decision that probably saved Hetzenauer's life. "I don't care if it looks stupid," he told the other instructors. "Let him shoot the way he shoots." Hetzenauer graduated from Bad Tölz in December of 1944, ranked second in his class despite using a technique that violated doctrine. He was assigned to the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, operating on the Western Front as German forces tried desperately to hold back the Allied advance following the failure of the Ardennes offensive. He arrived at the front on January 5, 1945. 7 days later, he had 23 confirmed kills. Not all of them were due to the head tilt. Many were simply the result of being a naturally gifted marksman in a target-rich environment. But the ones that mattered, the ones where he spotted enemy snipers before they spotted him, the ones where he acquired targets in low light or heavy cover, those were different. Those were because of how he held his head. The science behind what Hetzenauer discovered wouldn't be properly understood for decades. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers studying binocular vision and depth perception would begin to map out how the human brain integrates visual information from both eyes. They would discover that eye dominance is not the same as eye strength, and that forcing someone to use their dominant but weaker eye can actually impair performance. They would learn that peripheral vision on your strong eye side is significantly more effective at detecting movement than peripheral vision on your weak eye side. They would understand that the slight head tilt, what Hetzenauer did instinctively, creates what modern shooting instructors call a hybrid vision platform, where the dominant eye handles precision, aiming through the scope, while the strong eye handles threat detection and spatial awareness. But in January of 1945, none of this was known. All that was known was that Matthias Hetzenauer was killing Allied soldiers at a rate that seemed almost impossible for a teenager with 8 weeks of training. The American forces facing Hetzenauer's unit were from the 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden. They had seen German snipers before. The Eastern Front had created a generation of extraordinarily skilled German marksmen, men who had learned their craft in the brutal warfare around Stalingrad and Kursk. Many of these veterans had been transferred west as the Russian front collapsed. The Americans expected competent enemy snipers. They did not expect what they got. On January 14th, a patrol from the 82nd's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment entered a destroyed village east of Bastogne. The village, its name lost to history. Like so many small Belgian settlements obliterated in the winter of 44 and 45, consisted of perhaps 20 buildings, all damaged, most completely destroyed. Standard procedure was to clear it room by room, building by building, assuming German observers or stay-behind units might be present. The patrol leader was Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, a 3-year veteran who had survived the Sicily invasion and the Normandy drop. He knew how to read terrain, how to spot danger, how to keep his men alive. He ordered his squad to advance in bounds, using rubble for cover, maintaining proper spacing. Everything by the book. Hetzenauer watched them from 420 meters away, positioned in the collapsed second floor of what had been a barn. His hide was immaculate. He had spent 3 hours constructing it the previous night, using techniques learned at Bad Tölz. Debris from the collapsed roof provided overhead cover. Shattered farming equipment created irregular shapes that broke up his outline. He had even urinated in a tin can rather than risk leaving his position. He was invisible. But more importantly, he was observing them with his head tilted. The Americans moved well. They used cover properly, advanced in short rushes, and kept their weapons ready. But Hetzenauer saw something they didn't see. One of the soldiers, a rifleman near the rear of the formation, kept glancing at a specific window in a partially collapsed house. Just quick glances, maybe unconscious. The kind of thing you'd only notice if your peripheral vision was working at maximum efficiency and your brain was processing movement patterns. faster than normal thought. Hetzenauer shifted his aim. Not to the window that would be the obvious target. To the doorway 10 feet to the left of the window. He waited. 30 seconds. 40. Then the American soldier, having finally worked up the courage, moved toward the house to clear it. He went through the doorway. Hetzenauer fired. The 7.92mm round covered the 420 meters in just over half a second. It struck the soldier in the upper chest, just below the collarbone, passing through his lung and out his back. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The rest of the squad immediately went to ground, taking cover, trying to determine the direction of fire. This was standard training, and they did it well. But Hetzenauer was already scanning for his next target with that tilted head, that hybrid vision platform processing information faster than conscious thought. He saw the squad leader Donovan signaling to 2 soldiers, directing them to flank left toward the suspected sniper position. Hetzenauer watched them begin their movement, waited until they were in the open, between cover points. Fired again. The second soldier went down. Now the Americans knew they were dealing with something unusual. 2 shots, 2 kills, from an unknown position, with no muzzle flash visible and only the barest sound signature. The squad pulled back, calling for support. Hetzenauer remained in his hide for another 40 minutes, motionless, watching. When an American fire support team finally arrived and began suppressing the area with machine gun fire spraying bullets at every possible sniper position, he didn't move. The rounds impacted all around his position, some passing within meters. He stayed still. The Americans were firing at shadows and possibilities. They had no idea where he actually was. When darkness fell, he withdrew. By then, his count had risen to 25. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 6 weeks, Hetzenauer would refine his technique. He discovered that the head tilt worked best at angles between 12 and 18 degrees any less, and it didn't provide enough peripheral advantage anymore, and it started to create neck fatigue that affected his stability. He learned that the technique was most effective in low light conditions, dawn and dusk, when peripheral vision became even more important for detecting movement. He found that it gave him an almost preternatural ability to spot counter-snipers, the enemy marksmen who were specifically hunting him. This last point was crucial. German snipers on the Western Front in early 1945 were facing a problem their predecessors in Russia had rarely encountered: systematic counter-sniper operations. The Americans had developed doctrine for dealing with enemy sharpshooters, using 2-man sniper teams, artillery spotters, and carefully coordinated fire support. When a German sniper revealed his position with a shot, the American response was swift and overwhelming. Most German snipers lasted days, sometimes hours, before being killed or forced to relocate to less effective positions. Hetzenauer lasted because he saw the hunters before they saw him. That head tilt, that stupid trick his instructors had mocked, gave him the split-second advantage he needed to identify threats at the edge of his vision while maintaining his primary observation through his scope. On February 3, 1945, an American sniper team from the 82nd Airborne was specifically tasked with eliminating Hetzenauer. They didn't know his name, they called him the Ghost, but they knew his patterns, his kill zone, and roughly where he operated. The team consisted of Sergeant James O'Connor, a former competitive shooter from Pennsylvania, and his spotter, Corporal David Martinez. They were good at their job. O'Connor had 17 confirmed kills. They had successfully eliminated 4 German snipers over the previous 3 months. They set up their own hide in a location they calculated would give them observation over Hetzenauer's most likely positions. They were patient. They used proper concealment. They did everything right. Hetzenauer spotted them anyway. Not directly, he never actually saw them in their hide, but he saw something wrong. A pattern of absence where there should have been presence. Birds that avoided a certain stretch of hedgerow, a shadow that was too dark, too consistent, too controlled. His tilted head, his enhanced peripheral vision, his brain processing micro-details faster than conscious analysis, All of it came together in an instant of recognition. He didn't fire. That would reveal his position. Instead, he withdrew, circled around through a drainage ditch, and repositioned himself where he could observe the American. Position from the side. He waited. For 7 hours, he waited. Finally, as light began to fail, the American spotter Martinez shifted position slightly, adjusting his angle to account for the changing light. It was enough. Hetzenauer fired. Martinez died instantly. O'Connor, to his credit, immediately suppressed the area with return fire, forcing Hetzenauer to keep his head down. Then O'Connor executed a fighting withdrawal, using smoke and covering fire to disengage. He survived, but his partner didn't. The ghost had won. By March of 1945, Hetzenauer's confirmed kill count stood at 109. This number is verified by Wehrmacht records that survived the war, cross-referenced with unit logs and witness statements. It places him among the deadliest snipers of the Western Front, though far below the extraordinary numbers achieved by Soviet and Finnish snipers on the Eastern and Northern fronts, where conditions and tactics were different. But what makes Hetzenauer's story significant isn't the raw number, it's the survival rate. The average lifespan of a German sniper on the Western Front in early 1945 was between 6 and 14 days from first engagement to death or capture. Hetzenauer operated continuously for 12 weeks. He survived not because he was more accurate than his peers, several German snipers had comparable accuracy rates. He survived because he spotted threats faster. He survived because of how he tilted his head. The first week of March, 1945, brought a subtle shift to the Western Front. The weather was changing, winter releasing its grip on the Ardennes. More importantly, the character of the fighting was changing. The German army was no longer conducting defensive operations with any realistic hope of stabilizing the front. They were dying in place, unit by unit, buying time for a Reich that had perhaps weeks left to exist. Hetzenauer could feel it in the quality of the soldiers he was shooting. In January, he had faced hardened American paratroopers, men who moved with tactical discipline and professional caution. By March, he was facing replacement troops, fresh divisions rushed from training camps in England and France. They were brave, the Americans were always brave, but they were inexperienced. They made mistakes that veterans wouldn't make. They bunched up, they took unnecessary risks. They didn't properly clear their sectors before advancing. It should have made Hetzenauer's job easier. In some ways, it did. His kill rate actually increased slightly in early March. But it also meant something darker. It meant the war was ending, and ending badly. Every German soldier knew it by then. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but whether you would personally survive to see the defeat. On March 9th, Hetzenauer's unit received orders to fall back to new defensive positions west of Prüm. The withdrawal was supposed to be conducted in stages, with rear guard elements covering each phase of the movement. Hetzenauer was assigned to one of these rear guard positions, tasked with observing an approach route and eliminating any American reconnaissance elements that attempted to follow the withdrawing German forces. He established his hide in the ruins of a stone church, positioning himself in what remained of the bell tower. The position was tactically sound, good elevation, excellent fields of fire, multiple egress routes. He settled in just after dawn, expecting to remain in position for perhaps 12 hours before withdrawing himself. He stayed for 3 days. The American advance was slower than German intelligence had predicted. Instead of pushing hard against the withdrawing German units, the Americans seemed content to maintain contact while avoiding costly assaults. This was smart tactics. Why lose men attacking an enemy that was already retreating? But it left Hetzenauer in an increasingly dangerous position. His unit had completed its withdrawal. He was now alone, deep in what was rapidly becoming American-controlled territory, with no support and limited supplies. He had 6 rounds of ammunition left, a canteen half full of water, no food, and a decision to make. The doctrine was clear. A sniper in an untenable position should withdraw immediately. Remaining in place served no tactical purpose and risked capture or death for no strategic gain. But Hetzenauer had spotted something on the second day. An American forward observation post was established in a farmhouse roughly 800 meters from his position. If that post became operational, it would call in artillery on the route Hetzenauer's unit had used to withdraw. Artillery that might catch stragglers, wounded being evacuated, supply vehicles. Germans who were, in effect, his friends. He decided to stay, not out of any grand sense of duty to the Reich by March of 45. Very few German soldiers still believed in the ideology that had started the war. He stayed because those were his people being targeted, and he could do something about it. On the afternoon of March 11th, the American observation team began setting up their equipment. Hetzenauer could see them through his scope: an officer, a radio operator, and 2 security personnel. They were being professional about it, using proper concealment, minimizing their exposure. But they weren't expecting a sniper this far forward. They thought the Germans had all pulled back. Hetzenauer made his calculations. 800 meters, light wind from the northwest, perhaps 3 meters per second. Temperature around 4 degrees Celsius, meaning minimal air density effect on trajectory. The round would drop approximately 6.3 meters over that distance, requiring significant holdover. It was a difficult shot, made more difficult by the fact that he would only get one attempt before the Americans either went to ground or called in fire, a support on his position. He waited until the officer stepped to a window, consulting with the radio operator. 2 targets, overlapping, in a single frame. He tilted his head that familiar 15-degree angle that had become an unconscious habit and let his enhanced peripheral vision confirm there were no immediate threats in his kill zone. Then he focused everything on the sight picture. Crosshairs centered on the officer's chest, then raised to account for drop, breath control, heartbeat rhythm. The gentle press of the trigger that would send a 198-grain bullet downrange at 760 meters per second. The carabiner 98K fired. Through his scope, Hetzenauer watched the officer collapse. The radio operator froze for a critical half-second, long enough for Hetzenauer to work the bolt, chamber his second-to-last round, and reacquire. He fired again. The radio operator went down. The 2 security personnel immediately returned fire in his general direction, but they were shooting blind. Hetzenauer had already shifted position within the bell tower, moving to a secondary firing point he'd prepared. He watched the Americans evacuate their wounded. Both men were still alive, he noted with detached professionalism, and abandoned the observation post. The forward artillery position would not be established that day. He had 4 rounds left, no food, no support, and now, certainly, American units are actively searching for him. He remained in the bell tower until dark, then executed a careful withdrawal, moving only during darkness, hiding during daylight, drinking from streams and eating nothing. He made his way west, following the route his unit had taken 3 days earlier. It took him 5 days to cover 18 kilometers. On March 16, 1945, he rejoined what was left of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, near the German border. His commander, Hauptsturmführer Werner Schultz, looked at him like he was seeing a ghost. "We thought you were dead or captured," Schultz said. "How did you make it back?" Hetzenauer didn't mention the head tilt, didn't talk about the technique that had let him spot American patrols before they spotted him, that had kept him alive through 5 days behind enemy lines. He just said he'd been careful. His final confirmed kill came on March 23, 1945. By then, his count stood at 145. The circumstances were unremarkable: an American patrol, a 400-meter shot, a clean kill. What was remarkable was what happened afterward. Hetzenauer was repositioning after the shot, moving to a fallback position, when he heard the sound of tracked vehicles. American armored vehicles, multiple M4 Sherman tanks, and infantry support, advancing in force. This wasn't a patrol or a reconnaissance element. This was a full assault, and Hetzenauer was directly in its path. He had perhaps 30 seconds to decide. He could attempt to hide in place and hope the Americans passed by without detecting him. He could attempt to run, knowing that would make him visible and almost certainly result in his death, or he could surrender. For 19 years, Matthias Hetzenauer had been taught that surrender was dishonorable, that German soldiers fought to the death, that capture was worse than dying. But Hetzenauer had also spent the last 3 months watching the Reich collapse around him. He had seen the material abundance of the American army, the endless supplies, the casual way they could call in artillery or air support whenever they faced resistance. He had seen enough to know the war was over, had been over for months, and that dying now served no purpose beyond satisfying a doctrine that had already failed. He removed the magazine from his rifle, worked the bolt to clear the chamber, and placed the weapon on the ground. Then he stood up, hands raised, and walked toward the American column. The American soldiers who took him prisoner were from the 9th Armored Division, veterans who had been fighting since Normandy. They searched him professionally, separated him from his weapon and equipment, and called for an intelligence officer. Hetzenauer offered no resistance. He answered their questions name, rank, unit, but volunteered nothing else. He spent the next 3 weeks in a temporary POW facility near Remagen, then was transferred to a larger camp in Belgium. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Hetzenauer was still in Allied custody, one of millions of German prisoners waiting to learn their fate. What happened next is less well documented, but can be reconstructed from multiple sources. In June of 1945, American intelligence officers were conducting systematic interviews with captured German soldiers, trying to understand Wehrmacht tactics and training. A lieutenant named Robert Hargrove, who had himself been a competitive shooter before the war, was assigned to interview captured snipers. When he interviewed Hetzenauer and reviewed the German service record, 145 confirmed kills over 12 weeks with a survival rate that seemed almost impossible, he became curious. Hargrove asked Hetzenauer to demonstrate his shooting position. Hetzenauer complied, assuming the prone position with an imaginary rifle. Hargrove immediately noticed the head tilt. "Why do you hold your head like that?" Hargrove asked through a translator. Hetzenauer explained, as best he could, about his eye strength versus eye dominance, about peripheral vision, about how the tilt helped him spot targets faster. Hargrove, to his credit, understood immediately. He had read about binocular vision in shooting literature, understood that the standard doctrine wasn't necessarily optimal for everyone. Hargrove wrote a report. That report made its way through Army intelligence channels, was read by training command officers, and eventually contributed in a small way to changes in American sniper training doctrine. The idea that shooting position should be adapted to individual physiology rather than rigidly standardized began to gain acceptance. It would take decades for this to fully permeate military training, but the seed was planted. Hetzenauer himself was released from Allied custody in June of 1946. He returned to his home in Tyrol, Austria, and never spoke publicly about his wartime service. He worked as a surveyor, married, raised children, and died in 2004 at the age of 79. His obituary in the local Austrian newspaper mentioned his military service in a single line, focusing instead on his contributions to his community and his skill as a mountaineer. But among military historians and sniper instructors, Hetzenauer's story survived. Not because of his kill count, there were snipers on the Eastern Front with far higher numbers. Not because of any particular engagement or heroic action, but because he had, through instinct and accident, discovered something fundamental about human vision and combat effectiveness that contradicted accepted doctrine. Modern sniper training, across virtually all Western militaries, now emphasizes individual adaptation. Instructors assess each student's eye dominance and eye strength separately. They teach multiple shooting positions and encourage students to find what works best for their specific physiology. The rigid, one-size-fits-all approach that dominated World War II training has been abandoned, and if a student shows up with a tendency to tilt their head in a way that seems wrong but produces results, instructors now know to investigate rather than correct. They know that sometimes the body understands things the doctrine doesn't. The broader lesson from Hetzenauer's story extends beyond sniper tactics. In military organizations, as in any large institution, there is constant tension between standardization and adaptation. Standardization allows for efficient training, reliable performance, and easy integration of new personnel. But standardization can also become dogma, can calcify into doctrine that persists even when individual variation would produce better results. The German sniper schools of World War II were excellent by the standards of their time. They produced highly skilled marksmen who were, on average, more effective than their Allied counterparts. But they nearly failed Matthias Hetzenauer because they couldn't accommodate his individual variation. It took an instructor willing to question doctrine Hauptfeldwebel König at Bad Tölz to recognize that Hetzenauer's wrong technique was actually right for him. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The British Army nearly court-martialed officers who wanted to adopt skirmish tactics during the Napoleonic Wars because it violated doctrine about linear formations. The U.S. Army resisted adopting the M16 rifle despite evidence of its effectiveness, because it contradicted beliefs about the importance of rifle caliber and stopping power. Doctrine serves a purpose, but doctrine that cannot bend will eventually break. There is also something profound in the mundane nature of Hetzenauer's innovation. He didn't invent a new weapon system. He didn't develop revolutionary tactics. He just tilted his head differently. The advantage he gained was measured in fractions of a second, in percentage points of improved accuracy, in slightly enhanced peripheral vision. None of these advantages were dramatic on their own, but accumulated over dozens of engagements, they multiplied into the difference between 14 days of survival and 12 weeks, between average effectiveness and 6 times average effectiveness. This is how real tactical innovation often works, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through tiny optimizations that compound over time. A soldier who reloads 3% faster, a squad that communicates 5% more efficiently, a sniper who spots targets 0.7 seconds quicker. These margins seem insignificant until you multiply them across thousands of engagements, and then they become the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. Hetzenauer's story also illuminates something about the nature of expertise. True expertise isn't just knowing the rules, it's knowing when to break them. The instructors at Bad Tölz knew the rules of snipercraft. They could recite doctrine, demonstrate proper technique, and explain the reasoning behind every element of training. But König, the instructor who let Hetzenauer keep his head tilted, understood something deeper. He understood that rules are abstractions, useful generalizations that apply to most people most of the time, but not universal laws that apply to all people all the time. This kind of wisdom, the wisdom to recognize when exceptions should be made, when individual variation trumps standardized procedure, is rare in any institution, military or civilian. It requires confidence to question established practice. It requires humility to admit that the standard approach might not be optimal. And it requires judgment to distinguish between innovation that should be encouraged and deviation that should be corrected. König had that judgment. He saw that Hetzenauer's technique violated form but produced results. He could have insisted on conformity many instructors would have. Instead, he chose effectiveness over orthodoxy. That decision probably saved Hetzenauer's life and definitely improved his combat effectiveness. It also contributed, in a small way, to the evolution of sniper doctrine that would benefit soldiers for generations to come. The irony, of course, is that Hetzenauer was fighting for a regime that represented the opposite of this kind of wisdom. Nazi Germany was built on rigid ideology, on the belief that doctrine, racial, political, military, was absolute and universal. The idea that individual variation might be valuable, that local adaptation might be superior to centralized standardization, was fundamentally incompatible with Nazi philosophy. Yet here was Hetzenauer, a product of Nazi military training, succeeding precisely because he deviated from standardized doctrine. Here was an Austrian farm boy, educated in schools that taught Aryan supremacy and the infallibility of German military science, surviving because he trusted his instincts over his training. The Reich was full of such contradictions in its final months, ideology crumbling under the weight of reality, doctrine failing when confronted with material truth. By the time Hetzenauer surrendered to American forces in March of 1945, the German army had become a strange hybrid of fanaticism and pragmatism. There were still units that fought to the death for ideological reasons, still officers who believed in final victory. But there were also thousands of soldiers, like Hetzenauer, who had stopped believing in anything except survival. The head tilt that made him effective wasn't motivated by devotion to the Reich or belief in German superiority. It was motivated by the simple biological imperative to stay alive in an environment of industrial violence. This pragmatism, this focus on what worked rather than what was supposed to work, was perhaps the most honest thing about the German military in those final months. Stripped of ideology, reduced to the basic mathematics of survival, soldiers like Hetzenauer were left with only their skills and their adaptability. The head tilt was pure pragmatism. It worked. That was all that mattered. When American soldiers examined Hetzenauer's technique after his capture, they were, in effect, learning from an enemy whose political system they had just defeated. There was no cognitive dissonance in this for the Americans. They understood that tactical effectiveness and moral legitimacy were separate things. The Wehrmacht could be fighting for an evil cause while still employing effective tactics. Learning from enemy techniques wasn't endorsing enemy ideology. This ability to separate tactical analysis from moral judgment is another form of wisdom that Hetzenauer's story illustrates. The Americans didn't reject his head tilt technique because it came from a Nazi soldier. They evaluated it on its merits and incorporated useful elements into their own training. This is how professional militaries operate. They learn from everyone, friend and foe alike, because effectiveness is judged by results rather than source. There is one final element of Hetzenauer's story worth examining: the question of what his 145 confirmed kills actually meant. Each of those numbers was a human being. An American soldier, almost certainly young, almost certainly drafted rather than volunteered, who died hundreds or thousands of miles from home in a war that was already decided by the time Hetzenauer was killing them. Hetzenauer himself never spoke publicly about this. Unlike some veteran snipers who wrote memoirs or gave interviews, he remained silent about his wartime service. We can only speculate about what he thought, what he felt, about those 145 men. Did he see them as enemy soldiers, legitimate targets in a war he was conscripted to fight? Did he see them as human beings whose deaths weighed on his conscience? Did he compartmentalize, separating the mechanical act of shooting from the moral reality of killing? The historical record provides no answers. What we know is that he survived, that he returned home, that he lived a quiet civilian life for nearly 60 years after the war ended. Whether he found peace with what he had done, we cannot say. What we can say is that his story, the story of how a head tilt made him 6 times more effective at killing, is not primarily a story about killing at all. It's a story about adaptation, about the tension between doctrine and innovation, about the small margins that compound into large advantages. It's a story that has relevance far beyond sniper tactics or military history. In any field where performance matters, business, athletics, education, science, there is always tension between standardized best practices and individual adaptation. The challenge is knowing when to follow the standard approach and when to tilt your head 15 degrees, because that's what works for you. Hetzenauer's story suggests that the answer isn't always to follow doctrine, but it also isn't always to deviate from it. The answer is to be willing to experiment, to measure results honestly, and to privilege effectiveness over conformity when the evidence supports it. The German instructors at Bad Tölz weren't wrong to teach head-straight positioning as the standard approach. For most snipers, it probably was the optimal technique. They were wrong to insist that it was the only approach, to treat deviation as error rather than potential innovation. Koenig was right to let Hetzenauer experiment, to let the results speak for themselves. This balance between standardization and adaptation, between doctrine and innovation, is what separates good institutions from great ones. The German sniper program was good. It produced effective marksmen. But it nearly failed to be great because it almost couldn't accommodate Hetzenauer's variation. The modern sniper programs that learned from his example, that built individual assessment and adaptation into their doctrine, are great because they institutionalize the wisdom to let people tilt their heads when it makes them more effective. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.